Ottawa's Black Business Alliance, a place where you can learn to be your own person and build the future you want for yourself. Our mission is to help young entrepreneurs achieve their business goals through the best coaching, managing, consulting, and a slew of other services. Together, we can become a pillar in the Afro-Canadian community. Don't hesitate to contact us through our website at www.oba.ca, and remember that building tomorrow starts today. OBA Consulting. Take hold of your future. Welcome to BIA, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for shows on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best content the black community in Canada has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have an idea for a project you'd like us to help you with? We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to week 7 of our course, Early History, the African Renaissance, 1896 to the present. Today, we're going to be discussing the African women's rights movement in particular, but the African human rights movement as a whole. And the meeting that we'll focus on today is a very pivotal meeting, the seminar on the African Charter on Human Rights and African Women that happened in Lomé, Togo in 1995, March 8th through 9th, 1995. So we're going to be talking about some of the key political and economic realities of this time period. So today we're going to be focusing on kind of where we left off last week, the 80s going into the 90s, and we'll finish up around the year 2003 today. So generally about 20 years. We'll spend a lot of time in the 80s and 90s. And our discussion will talk about the development of the African human and people's rights system in the 1980s and 90s, what led to that, what were the results of that, what are some of the key instruments and institutions of the African human and people's rights system. And then we'll talk about how the political and economic situation of that time period affected the rights of women in the African world. So last week we introduced those concepts of consciousness, and we talked about racial consciousness, black consciousness, the black conscious movement in South Africa, black consciousness in Brazil. We talked about class consciousness with the various revolutions based around class issues in Africa, and we focused a little bit on the Ethiopian revolution. And then we also talked about gender consciousness, and we went back to Brazil, and we talked about some other places, women in liberation movements in the 70s. So all of that is going to blend right into what we discussed today, because the African human and people's rights system is based largely off those consciousnesses. So we'll talk about that. Some of this stuff should sound familiar to many of us that are on, because a lot of us lived through this time period. So we'll be able to see some things that probably look a little bit more familiar to other things that we talked about. And this is also the time period where by the time we get to the end of the day in 2003, we will see some of the more explicit mentions of this idea of African Renaissance. Now, other folks had mentioned it before. People we've talked about in the past. Nnamdi Azikiwe talked about the African Renaissance. Sheikh Anta Diop talked about the African Renaissance, and Nkrumah mentioned African Renaissance. But it really, for our current situation and our current time, the idea of African Renaissance really starts to take hold at the end of this time period. So we'll get into that today as well. So where are we at in 1995? So when we're right a year after the complete liberation, in a way, of Africa from all forms of colonization, because 1994 is when really apartheid kind of ends. This is the election of Nelson Mandela. South Africa is free. So in a sense, the beginning of the 1990s is a time of victory, but also it's a time of great hardships in Africa, economic and political hardships. So you get a mixed bag when we get to the 1990s, and we'll talk about that. But ultimately, Africa is quote unquote free from colonialism. Apartheid's over, Africa's free. So what is this new, completely free Africa going to look like as we approach the new millennium? And particularly since African women make up more than half of Africa's population, what are the situation of African women and how did they respond to this new reality? So although I said Africa was free from traditional colonialism once apartheid ended in South Africa, while traditional colonialism was ending, we started to see the implementation of a new form of colonialism that Nkrumah labeled neo-colonialism, which he titles a book, Neo-Colonialism, written in 1965, and he calls it the last stage of imperialism. This is a take off of V.I. Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism. So he writes his book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, in 1965. And we're talking a lot about Nkrumah's works. Last week, we focused on the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, and we focused on class struggle in Africa. And this week, we're kind of presenting neo-colonialism, and this is a key term for this week, because Nkrumah's writings in the 1960s, as freedom was coming or traditional colonization was ending, but he's also seeing, as a result of the coup, as a result of things that he saw before he was removed from his position in Ghana, he's seeing what Africa is going to be for the rest of the 20th century. It's going to be stuck in this new form of colonialism, and he wanted everybody to know. So he writes this very thick book, it's about 400 pages, called Neo-Colonialism, and he breaks it down. He says, look, and we talked about this before, the essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside. We talked about this before. So by the time we get to 1995, Africa is in the grips of neo-colonialism. And in particular, these are what it looks like, the components of neo-colonialism: economic exploitation, puppet governments and client states, military assistance, and quote unquote economic aid. Economic aid. And this book breaks down all the ways neo-colonialism works. So in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, as Africa is getting free and going into this period of neo-colonialism, we need to talk about exactly what this looks like. And it wasn't just the states on the African continent, the 54, 55 states on the African continent. This idea of neo-colonialism is impacting African people all over the world. Because at the same time that Africa is getting freedom, we talked about this as well, the Caribbean countries are getting free. But yet they're also going into this realm of neo-colonialism. A lot of it being engineered by the US government, as well as business interests in the US and in some of these countries that are committed to economic exploitation, the support of puppet regimes, quote unquote military assistance, and economic aid. So I want to show a video very quickly that kind of breaks down one of the aspects of neo-colonialism that becomes very big in the 1970s and 80s. So before I play this, let me set the stage. 1970s, you have an oil crisis. A lot of the newly independent countries that had only been free 10 years, some 15 years, are now in this oil crisis. And when the oil prices spiked, the price of raw materials, which most of these countries were dependent on, begins to drop because they don't control the prices for raw materials. So when those prices drop, food prices go up, oil prices go up, these countries are starting to feel economic pressure. And not only that, they're also, again, the exploitation that started during colonization doesn't really abet once the countries get independence. So what do? Your country is strapped for cash. You need resources to fulfill all the promises that these governments made during the independence movement. When people got independence from Britain and France and Belgium and Portugal, and they are expecting that their sacrifice, and we talked about the bloody struggles for independence, even in the places where it wasn't settlers, there was still blood was shed for independence. People expected that hospitals would be built, education would be provided, infrastructure would be maintained and upgraded, and all these things that were the expectations of independence. When countries were unable, or in some cases unwilling to do so, we started to see more unrest. We started to see more problems. So states need to figure out a way to get money, economic aid, to get out of the situation that really neocolonialism put them in. And when we talk about the African world, we go back to what Nkrumah had said back in '63. If Africa had united, maybe the states wouldn't be in that situation, but nobody listened in '63. So by the time we get to the '70s and '80s, things are looking a little rough because of the African economies being tied in with the world economy, and then recession and oil crisis and all these things. So when this happens, the masses of African people are definitely affected, but these economic problems have a disproportionate effect on African women. When we think about the people that produce those raw materials that are going to the world market, prices that they don't control, most of that is grown, if we're talking about agriculture, most of that is grown by women. Women produce 80% of the basic food commodities in Africa and many of the other agricultural goods. So when food prices or the price of raw materials drops and other food prices go up, and talk about in particularly imported food, it negatively affects these women. In addition, like I said, the global market fluctuations for materials and food prices, both in '74 and '79, disproportionately affect women who are taking care of their families, disproportionately affect women who make up most of the farmers in Africa. And then women also suffer the negative effects of what the international community, the Western aspect of the international community, put on these countries that were asking for assistance. And that was something that the IMF and the World Bank created called structural adjustment policies. Daniel, if you would, before I go into this, I want you to pull up that video and play a little bit of that explains what these policies were in the '80s and into the early 1990s.
First of all, you go to the private banking system and you see where can I get a private banking loan because I'm strapped for cash and need some support, and I have a trouble paying my overseas bills. The private banks will lend to you. Then you've got to do something if you're the leader of the country. And typically what you've got to do is to cut back your spending in some way and try and get more money so that the impact of those cutbacks are not as severe as they otherwise would be. It's at that point that you generally come to the IMF. What you really need is to sit down with them and say, look, can I work on a 5-year program? And in the meantime, I'm strapped for some cash, so that you help me out from get out of the cash bind and then put it in the context of a long-term development plan. And they said, no, long-term development in Europe. We are here only to see who you will monitor, why you want to find it, and we lend you some money in a very short time frame at full interest rate to get you off the line. And they then impose upon you tremendous restrictions in what you can spend.
Every reach agreement still measures the budget, the exchange rate, still interest rates, banks, maybe privatization, and say, yeah, we think this could solve your problem.
And you say to them, but if I do it that way, when I finish repaying you, I'm going to leave the land all over because this can't solve my problem with it, not our problem.
What I did was a condition which the government could not meet. Only government failed to meet, you would have to renegotiate a new law in which conditions became tighter. The IMF
said, you must spend only so much money on health and education. And the implication of that was that you had to cut out something. Essentially, what the African wanted us to do was to devalue our currency. That's the first thing, make our dollar cheap.
They needed to expand their exports and diminish their imports. And the best way of making this make foreign currency more expensive.
And since our society is so heavily dependent on imported food, imported fuel, imported books to go to school, imported medicine, and we devalue the cost of those things we import go up to the system. And as a result, the economy today is much more under the control of foreigners, not necessarily through direct ownership, but through the mechanism of debt. In the 1970s, we owed $800 million. By the end of the 1980s, we owed $4 billion. Nowadays, we owe $7 billion. The debt is rising, and all the time the debt is rising, all the capacity to export to produce is getting less.
All right, thank you for that, Daniel. So that's from a film called Life and Debt in Jamaica. It's actually a really good film that breaks down the results of these policies that Nkrumah would call neo-colonialist, but in traditional political economic studies, it's called neoliberalism, neoliberal policies that were promoted by the West, by the US, by Western Europe. And this was all within the time frame of the end of the Cold War, when these things were happening. So when the oil crisis and the recessions happened in 74, 79, the Soviet Union feels that stuff too. So by the time we get to the 1980s, reforms are happening inside of the Soviet Union. There's calls for, an end to the regime, political changes in the Soviet Union, less support from the Soviet Union to the so-called third world. So countries like Cuba, countries in Africa that had formed relationships with the Soviet Union are now struggling because this superpower is collapsing in on itself. And there's all types of ethnic and nationalist problems inside the countries that would emerge out of the Soviet Union. And we're seeing, the repercussions of some of that still today with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But all of that is happening in the 80s. So once in 1989, when the Soviet Union pretty much collapsed and we see the end of the Cold War, that neoliberalist model is the only one still standing. So countries are almost forced to get involved in that, get involved in the IMF, get involved in the World Bank if they want to sustain. So how does this negatively affect African women? 70s, 80s, 90s, all this is happening, these structural adjustment programs. Number one, the privatization that was mentioned in that video. Instead of the state providing particular services like education, healthcare, and so on, now they become private, which means they become more expensive. And if you are an African woman trying to send your kids to school, trying to get healthcare for your family, now those prices go up. And now decisions have to be made. Families, I can only send one of my children to school. Is it going to be the boy child or is it going to be the girl child? Because of patriarchy that was exacerbated during colonization, that boy child went to school. Less educational chances for African women. The devaluation of currency, again, making imports more expensive. Trying to feed your family, now it's more expensive to import things. Less government spending on social services. All of this is happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is negatively affecting the rights of African women. And in addition to that, we also have these traditional practices that we'll get into as well that are also negatively affecting African women's rights. So the women begin to organize. I mean, they had already been organized. I mean, even during the colonial era, you had women's organizations. But on a Pan-African scale, after independence, we have organizations like the Pan-African Women's Organization, which brought women from all over the continent together to talk about the future of African women and their place in the newly independent states. But in the 70s, 80s, it starts to kick up more because the effects of the promises that were made to independence aren't being met. The effects of the neoliberal policies are really starting to hit African women disproportionately hard. Now, African men are suffering too, but it's a disproportionate effect on African women. Not only that, the governments are becoming much more repressive in a lot of places. People want to stay in power. So we're starting to see these dictatorships emerge, and folks being thrown in jails that are questioning the government. The freedoms of the press are being curtailed. Military. Now, not every military takeover was bad, but a lot of them were. And when that happens, you start to see a crackdown on political rights. So economic problems, crackdown on political rights, repression, all of this stuff is happening in various places in the 80s. In order to deal with all of this, experts got together in Africa and people said, we have a human rights situation in Africa, and particularly some states were worse than others. Zaire, under Mobutu, horrible human rights record. We look at what was going on in the Central African Republic underneath its Napoleonic emperor. I think his name was Bukasa. He literally styled himself after Napoleon. This guy was, just imbued with this idea that he was going to be an emperor in Africa, and committed all types of human rights abuses. While this was happening, Africans say, you know what, we have to take control over the situation. We need to come up with something that will show not only the world, but ourselves that we can handle the human rights situation on the continent. Because we keep going to these meetings at the UN and all these countries are saying, oh, Africa, you need to handle the human rights situation, even though you're in the background engaging in neo-colonial activities that's not allowing that to happen. Africa is still being criticized. And truth be told, an African articulation of human rights was needed at this time. What does it mean to live in an African country, and how is the state going to respect your rights? So in 1979, a meeting of experts was held to discuss the idea of creating an African instrument about human rights, an African legal document that's going to outline what human rights means in Africa, because maybe it means something different than what it means in the Americas, or what it means in Europe, or what it means in Asia. Maybe there's an African conception of human rights. So these experts, legal experts, cultural experts, got together in 1979 in Senegal, and they were addressed by the still leader of Senegal, Leopold Senghor. We talked about Senghor weeks before. He's one of the fathers of the Negritude movement. He never gave up on that idea, that there was a certain essential Africanness in the way Africans did things. They call it Negritude. And he said, look, if we're going to make a treaty about human rights, we need to look back to African civilization. He says, African civilization, like all other ancient civilization, always respected man. Therefore, you must keep constantly in mind our values of civilization and the real needs of Africa. So we said, let's just not do a copy and paste of Western human rights treaties. That might work for them, but let's really look at our own culture. Let's really look at the needs of Africa to do this. He said, room should be made for this African tradition in our Charter of Human Rights, while bathing in our philosophy, which consists in not alienating the subordination of the individual to the community in coexistence, and giving everyone a certain number of rights and duties. This was key. So this is what Senghor is telling these experts that are meeting in Senegal. Keep these African philosophical ideas in mind as you make this legal document that's going to be for the entire continent. And this is all under the auspices of the Organization of African Unity. That's who's putting all this together, bringing all these experts together. These experts created a document based off the following three ideas: that the charter must be based in traditional African culture and values, that the enjoyment of rights also entails the duties on the part of the individual, and that a continental organ would be established to promote and protect human rights in Africa. Up until this point, there was no African Commission on Human Rights. If something happened in Zaire, it just happened in Zaire. That was it. And then there was no overarching, African committee to check it. It just happened. You might be able to go to the UN if you can make it that far, but that was it. So they said, no, instead of letting the international community tell us, we're going to create an African organ to handle our own human rights issues. The man responsible for drafting this document, the man that put most of the work into it, was a Senegalese judge named Keba Mbaye. He is the father of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. That took all what the experts had negotiated on and thought about and what they believed what should be in this document. He put it all together and he drafted it. Now, this is one of the most important developments in the second half of the 20th century in Africa. And I spent a lot of time reading this because this is what I did my PhD research on, was on this document and its promotion. But essentially, for the first time, African people got together, probably for the first time since the Garvey movement, because Garvey had something called the Declaration of the Rights of the Black Man. I might be getting that name mixed up. But this was official. These were all the African countries sending their experts, getting together and saying, look, this is what we're going to lay out. To be an African, this is what your state has to do for you. And this is also what you have to do for your state as an individual. Because remember, that was a key aspect of African culture. It's not just about you. It's also about you as an individual connecting with the community. So, right off the bat, Mbaye and the experts write a preamble. Now, if you ever read a legal document, whether it's the Constitution of the United States or the Charter Rights and Freedoms in Canada or any legal document, the preamble gives you the philosophical basis of what you're about to read next, all the rights that you're guaranteed, and why the authors felt it appropriate to create this document. So I want to just read this, and if you could share this on the screen. So right at the beginning, this is what the document says. It says, we, the African states, members of the OAU, parties to the present convention, agree to say this. Take into consideration the virtues of the historical tradition and values of African civilization, which should inspire and characterize their reflection on the concept of human and people's rights. So right off the bat, they say we're basing this in African civilization. They say, considering that the enjoyment of rights and freedoms also implies the performance of duties on the part of everyone, convinced that it is henceforth essential to pay particular attention to the right to development, and that civil and political rights cannot be disassociated from economic, social, and cultural rights in their conception, as well as universality and the satisfaction of economic, social, and cultural rights is a guarantee for enjoyment of civil and political rights. I'll go back to this because this is key. Probably the most revolutionary statement of the whole thing. Again, this is the introduction to this document. So right off the bat, they're saying that we're conscious of our duty to achieve the total liberation of Africa. This is 1981 when this was written. So South Africa's not free yet. Namibia isn't free yet. The total liberation of Africa, the peoples of which are still struggling for their dignity and genuine independence, and undertaking to eliminate colonialism, neo-colonialism, apartheid, Zionism, and to dismantle aggressive foreign military bases and all forms of discrimination, particularly those based on race, ethnic group, color, sex, language, religion, or political opinions. This is probably the most important paragraph in this preamble. Because what it's saying is, we're writing this charter. We're creating this new idea of what it means to be an African citizen. And this is why we're doing it. To get rid of colonialism, to get rid of neo-colonialism, apartheid, Zionism, and to dismantle aggressive military bases. This is still the law in Africa. Because every country, after this charter was created, every country signed up for it and agreed to this treaty. Yet some of these things are still happening in Africa. But I wanted to point out that it's not legal what's happening in Africa, particularly these aggressive foreign military bases like AFRICOM. We'll get into that next week. But this is what this was designed to do. So thank you for sharing it. And let me get back on here. Yeah. Okay. Once this charter was created, these three things again became the key elements of it. Number one, the indivisibility of all rights. Prior to the African Charter, most human rights treaties separated these two things. So if you're a state, like Canada or the United States, or the United States isn't a good example because the United States doesn't ratify any human rights treaties. The United States doesn't even care. But some states, you could sign a treaty that says you guarantee political rights and civil rights. That's one treaty. The UN has it set up like that. That's one treaty. So rights like the right to freedom of assembly, the right to freedom of the press, freedom of religion, political participation, the right to vote, all these things are political and civil rights. That's one element of rights. Another element of rights are economic rights, the right to housing, the right to food, the right to healthcare, the right to a safe natural environment. All these things are economic rights. Social rights, that right to education, the right to freedom of movement, all these types of things. But they're usually in separate documents. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights puts them in one document and says, no, one area isn't more important than the other. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union would say the economic rights are more important than the social and political rights. What's the point of having the right to vote if you don't have food? What's the point of having the right to political assembly if you don't have a house? Whereas the West would say, particularly the United States would say, we'll give you the right to vote. We'll give you the right to freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Well, we ain't paying for you to have no house. You better get it yourself. You ain't got food, that's your problem. You don't got clean water, that's your problem. You better, use these other freedoms to get that type of stuff. African Charter said, no, you got to have them all in the same document because they're all important. They all feed off of each other. So that's an African element to human rights. This charter also included people's rights. We don't exist just as individuals, we also exist as groups. So the African Charter said peoples have rights, collectives have rights. The right to development is something that Africans gave to the human rights discourse, that all peoples have the right to development. All peoples have the right to a safe, natural environment. All peoples have the right to security. So that's different. That's a different way of looking at human rights, not just as individuals. And then lastly, as individuals, because in Africa, we have these philosophical concepts like Ubuntu. I am because we are because I am. There's a balance between the individual and the community. So because there's that balance, not only do individuals get rights, meaning that the state can't, or the society can't infringe on your rights, can't throw you in jail for any reason. They can't kill you because of your religious beliefs. They can't stop you from politically participating. But at the same time, you as an individual also have duties to the state. If the state's going to protect your rights, you need to protect the right to make sure that you're giving what you can to promote African unity. That's one of the duties in this charter, that every African has the right to promote African unity. Every African has the right to defend, duty to defend Africa from foreign aggression. So all these things are in this charter. One of the things that this charter sets up, they set up the African Commission on Human Rights. It's an 11-person panel that is based in the Gambia. And whenever there's a human rights violation in Africa, people can take their complaint to the African Commission to try to get some redress. The African Commission is also responsible for promoting human rights in Africa. So these commissioners who come from all over Africa, there's 11, they visit different African countries, promoting human rights, looking at the human rights record of countries doing different things. It also set up a system for other instruments to be added, because this was a great treaty, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. But one of the things it didn't do well, it did not talk about the rights of African women particularly well. There's only about 2 articles in there that even mention women. There's one, Article 3 says there'll be no discrimination in Africa based off of sex. That's one, that's good, but more could have been said. And then another one says, it's African states have to protect the rights of African children and women and all that. But that was it. Nothing more than that. So leaders at the time that were promoting this system, after it was written and states had agreed to it in 1985, everybody had enough states had signed on this charter to make it what they call in legal terms enforced, meaning a certain number of states signed it so it becomes actual law. One of the states that signed it was the state of Burkina Faso. And I can never talk about this time period without talking about this man, without talking about Thomas Sankara, because we know Mandela. Some of us know Nkrumah. More people should know Thomas Sankara. He was the leader of Burkina Faso during this time. He became president in 1983, took over from a military coup. And like I always say, not every military coup was bad. This was one actually supported by the people. There was a puppet government that was in the pocket of France, and he takes over from them. And he comes up with a number of policies that actually for the people. National self-esteem is what, and I'm talking about Sankara because he represents the spirit of the African Charter. This is what a leader who's upholding what that charter was about for the people. National self-esteem. He changed the name of Burkina Faso. Wasn't always called Burkina Faso. It was called Upper Volta. But he said, no, we're going to change the name. Burkina Faso means the land of the upright peoples. That's the first thing he did when he came into office. He said, no, we're changing the name. Upper Volta, that's something that the French came up with during colonization to say this is what this region is. No, we're going to be called the land of the upright people. He stressed food security. He said, we're not going to keep importing food. If we're going to uphold human rights, that means we got to support our farmers. That means we got to make sure that the prices aren't exorbitant and people aren't starving. So we need to produce our own food. Africa today is still food insecure. I've been talking about it for the past couple of weeks. We're about to be in another famine situation in East Africa. He was promoting food security back in the 80s. He was promoting women's rights. He looked at the chart and looked at the things. He said, this is still not enough. I'm going to promote women to political positions. I'm going to make sure women have economic opportunities, educational opportunities are going to be equal in the country. Environmental protection. Again, this is the 80s. And he was talking about greening Burkina Faso in the 1980s. Increase human development, building more hospitals, more educational systems, fighting against corruption. One of the things I love that Thomas Sankara did. One thing about him personally, he didn't take any money. When he was assassinated, and we'll get it, we won't talk about it, but he was assassinated by one of his best friends who was working with the French. Yes. We did a whole class on snitches and sellouts where we tell that story. So you can look that up on our course website. And that guy just got, he was president from 87 until 2015 when he was removed. But anyway, he was fighting against corruption and he was incorruptible. When this man died, all he had as the head of state was a bicycle, a guitar, and a few $100s. He didn't steal from the people. He lived what he was actually preaching. He lived in a modest house with him and his family. One of the things I love that he did, all the people that were in government were driving around in Mercedes Benz, and he looked and he said, wait a minute, you can get to the same place in I forget which model it was, but it's a regular car. It wasn't a Honda, but just think about Honda. He's like, no, you're gonna get a regular car. Why do you need to drive in a Mercedes Benz just because you're a government official? No, we selling all of that. We gonna get some Honda Civics, and you guys can get to where you need to go there. When we travel abroad, we're not staying in these 5-star hotels. We're staying in a regular, nice hotel because the money is the people's money. It belongs to the women of Burkina Faso. It belongs to the workers of Burkina Faso. It belongs to the children of Burkina Faso. Why are we wasting it on these things? So we fight against corruption and end to foreign dependency. And above all, African unity. And because of this, and particularly these last two, he became a threat to France. He became a threat to the United States, particularly when he came for a UN meeting in New York. He makes a speech in Harlem. And he has his, because he's a military man. He was a young guy too. He had his Uzi on his shoulder, and he's speaking in French to this African American gathering in Harlem. And he said, Harlem is our black house. It's one of the capitals of the black world. And he says, as something happens to you all here, we're ready to defend you. And he had his Uzi with him, and you see the crowds cheering. So he understood, just like Garvey and Nkrumah and the others, that everybody in the African world is all in this together. because of this example, they had to take him out. And not only did they, try to physically, and what they succeeded in physically killing Thomas Sankara, there's been a continued attempt to try to erase him from the memory of African people. That's why so many people don't know about Sankara. It's important, Nelson Mandela is a great figure, but there's a reason why that story is told. It's a story of reconciliation. It's a story of, okay, we're not going to kill all these white people in South Africa. They're still going to be able to control the economy. And Nelson Mandela is this great old man, this great peace figure. You don't hear about Sankara, who was doing all the things that every African leader should do. When you learn about the story of Thomas Sankara, you're learning about the model of what African leadership should look like in the 21st century. This is why I never let this time period go without talking about him. But going back to what we're discussing, he supported women's rights and the women's organizations that emerged in Burkina Faso. Let me go a little bit faster and we'll talk about it. So African women were getting together, not only among each other, but also among other women around the world that were going through the similar issues of neoliberalism, neocolonialism all over the world. And even in the so-called developed countries, women's rights weren't being upheld. Not in the United States, of course, not in Canada. So you had a feminist movement emerging, but then you also had the movement of the women in the other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who had their own critiques of the white feminist movement. And these things would come to a head during the UN Decade for Women between 75 and 85. Because particularly in 1980 and in 1985, you had the women from the so-called third world confronting the white women in the UN in these meetings saying, hey, you don't speak for all women. You don't speak for all women. And we have particular human rights needs that are connected with the rights of workers, because while you're fighting to get into the workforce, we're already in the workforce. We're already the backbones of our economies. So in addition to fighting for women's rights, we also need to be fighting for economic rights. And we're tired of hearing you all talk about how patriarchal Africa is, how patriarchal Latin America is, or Asia is, and you aren't even critiquing the militarism and the neo-colonial activities of your own country. So the African women really stood up, particularly when they had the meeting in Kenya, and many of them were able to attend. So you got women like Berhane Rossworth of Ethiopia, who had her own problems with the mainstream international white-led feminist movement. She had been living outside of it. Earlier in her life, she lived in Ethiopia, grew up in Ethiopia, had attended some of the Pan-African Women's Organization meetings that occurred in the 1960s, in the 70s. But then she moved to Europe. I think she moved to Sweden. And she was in Sweden, and she saw on TV a Swedish documentary about female genital mutilation in Africa. And the way that they presented Africa as barbaric and backwards. And she said, no, we can't have this. We can't have the West coming in and presenting Africa like this. Yeah, this is an issue in Africa, and we need to address it, but not the way that they address it. So she decides to go back to Africa to start the Inter-African Committee on Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children. This organization said, look, Africa, we're trying to make strides with women's rights, but we need to address some of the things within our own culture that are negatively affecting the rights of African women and children, and girl children particularly, including FGM, including some of these other patriarchal ideas that exist. So she organized, started in 1984. You had Femnet organized, another organization of African women. Women in Law and Development, which was started by Ugandan Florence Butegwa, who also served on the African Commission in 1989. So you can see a lot of these women's rights organizations emerge, all with the goal of bringing an African voice to the women's movement, the international women's movement, as well as forcing African governments to confront their own patriarchy and their own abuses of women's rights. Because you got to think, at this time, there is no woman that's a head of state in Africa. So from independence to I gotta get my dates right, but it might have been the early 2000s. Whenever the president of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, whenever she becomes president of Liberia, and I think it's in the early 2000s, up until that point, no head of state in Africa and very few of the parliamentarians had been women. So the people that are making these policies are all men. Even the people that drafted the African Charter were all men. So there's no question as to why women's rights weren't given as much attention in the charter, because it was drafted by men. So these organizations rose to fight those things, and they networked, and they met under the auspices of the UN. They met on their own throughout Africa, sharing ideas. How do we fight harmful practices without attacking African culture as a whole? How do we force our governments to create policies with women's rights in mind? So they do all of this, and they meet. They meet in Nairobi. They meet in a conference in Dakar in Senegal in 1994. And then the one that we'll talk about after our first Q&A, the most important, the Lomé conference in Togo in 1995. So all these African women's organizations are getting together and pushing governments to look at the rights of African women. So let's stop there for a second before I talk about this meeting, and let me open it up to any questions that folks may have. And Daniel, let me know what's in the chat, and then we can go to people with their hands up.
There's nothing in the chat right now, but Mr. Francis, go ahead, and then Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good morning. Dr. Ledbetter, thank you for reminding me of Jean de Beaucassin, and now I understand why, during his inauguration, he rode in a horse-drawn chariot.
Yeah, yes.
White horses imported from France. So now I understand his connection with his fascination with Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah.
So thanks for that reminder. And he, by the way, he was the president. I don't remember what his name on the document, but he was the president for 11 years. And at the time of his inauguration, he had his baby son.
Yeah.
He declared the son would be his successor.
Yeah. This is Central African Republic. This is the Central African Republic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, definitely. And again, I'll also want to, bring this, while this is happening, you have Mobutu and Zaire, who we talked about when Mobutu comes on the scene. He's the chief of staff in Lumumba's army, turns on him, becomes a puppet of the West, and runs Zaire from the late 60s all the way up into the mid 1990s and robs the country blind and puts a lot of, and we talked about the Democratic Republic of Congo being the richest place on earth in terms of mineral wealth. The country's debt was essentially in French banks and in private bank accounts from Mobutu. And then Mobutu tried to use African culture to hide everything he was doing. He changed the country's name from Congo to Zaire, saying that this is a more African name. He changes his own name to Mobutu Sese Seko, and he finances the rumble in the jungle. You guys remember that fight between Ali and George Foreman, and presents himself as this great bearer of African culture while at the same time exploiting the people. So, and then across the Atlantic, you got Papa Doc doing the same thing in Haiti throughout the 60s and then into the 70s, and then had his son, Baby Doc, named president when he died. So we got and masking all of this in noir, at least at the beginning, in noirism and this idea of blackness that he developed. So you got folks doing things like this all over the African world. Mr. Thomas, go ahead. I see your hand.
Morning, all. As well presented as this lecture is, I'm still left confused as to human rights. Because we talk about children's rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, so on and so forth. And even when you get to some of those, you get tied up in legalese. So what is human human rights when it comes right down to it?
Okay, that's good. Good question. So essentially, in a nutshell, what we're saying is there are certain things that the state has to do to make sure that the individual lives their best life possible. These are human rights. The idea that the state can't do things to harm you, and the state has to fulfill things to make sure that you have at least the basic foundation to live your life. So it comes off the notion that human beings are a special category, that we're different than animals, we're different than nature in a way, that have to be protected if we're going to live in society. So going off that basis, that there's something inherently special about human beings, not in an incredibly hegemonic way. That means that we're so much better than nature, but that there is something inherently special about human beings that needs to be protected by other human beings. So when we form societies, there are certain things that our governments can't do to us, and there are certain things that our government should do for us to make sure that we're foundationally okay. The things that the government can't do to us, the government can't torture us as a violation of human rights. The government can't discriminate against us. And this is where those other categories come in, and we get more of those, because we realize as time goes on that there's a number of ways that people can be discriminated against, whether it's by race, whether it's by sex, whether it's by gender, whether it's by language or religion, or all these different realms of discrimination that and now we talk about sexual orientation and gender identification. The government should not discriminate or not allow discrimination to exist based off these different categories. And we keep finding new categories because human beings keep finding new ways to discriminate against each other. So there's that. There's things the government can't do to you. It can't throw you in prison for any reason. It can't stop you from being participating in politics reasonably. Can't force you to do certain things. Then there's things that the government has to fulfill, that because we decided to live in the government, and the governments have a responsibility to make sure that the water is clean, because we can't do that as individuals. We don't have the power as individuals to go out and clean the water. That's the government's job. So part of, for a government to be considered, a modern government, an upholder of rights, it has to make sure that the water is clean. The government has to make sure that businesses aren't polluting. The government has to make sure that businesses aren't engaging in practices that harm the citizens. Certain governments who have signed on treaties for economic rights have committed themselves to saying, look, as the government, we're going to make sure that everybody has decent housing. We recognize that as a human right. Experts around the world have gotten together and they say, look, in the 21st century, to be a civilized government, you need to make sure that everybody has suitable housing. That's not to say everybody needs to be living in a mansion, but there are some standards of what housing needs to look like. And if you're a modern government, you need to make sure that people are taken care of in that regard. You need to make sure that people have health care. To be a civilized government in the 21st century, citizens should have basic health care. Like, this shouldn't even be a discussion anymore. And a lot of these discussions are, from my perspective, are aimed at the United States, because that's where I grew up at. And the United States doesn't respect any of these rights. So at least in Canada here, you got health care. Everybody got a health card. You can go, you can get checked out. And that's not saying that every aspect of your medical history is going to be covered. You know, you got to pay for medicine, different types of things. But there's at least a basis that we're going to try to protect your right to health. Those are things that the government has to fulfill. So the government has to respect your rights in certain extent, protect your rights from other people, like private industries. You know, the government has a right to protect workers. So if you're working for a company that's using child labor or that's not giving you breaks or days off or that type of thing, or you're in unsafe conditions, the government has a responsibility to protect you. The government has a responsibility to respect your right, the right to privacy, your right to movement, all these things. And the government has the responsibility to fulfill rights, like, again, housing, the right to healthcare, the right to live in a clean environment, all of these types of things. So that's, in a nutshell, what human rights are. And these were, in the 80s and into the 90s, because of the particular situations, political, economic, and social and cultural situations of Africa, African countries said we need to develop our own understanding of human rights. Some of these things are going to overlap. Everybody around the world has the right to life, fundamentally. You know, the government can't just kill you for any reason. And more states are actually moving away from the death penalty even. So the right to life is one of those universal ones. And there's no country in the world that says citizens don't have the right to life. But there are specific African elements, like the idea of people's rights, that people have rights as collectives, the idea that the individual also has duties to society, not just can expect things from society, but you also have a duty to society. And then, like I said earlier, that indivisibility between those economic rights and those civil and political rights. I could probably teach my master's degree is in international human rights law. So I could probably teach a whole class just on that, because it is a deep subject, but I just wanted to give that brief overview. So with that being said, like I mentioned, when the charter was drafted, not a lot about the particular situation of African women. So in 1995, a seminar was organized called the Seminar on the African Charter on Human Rights and African Women. One of the key people of this conference was an activist, a writer, a judge, a legal scholar, just a phenomenal individual named Vera Duarte from Cape Verde. Cape Verde are the islands off of West Africa that had been colonized by the Portuguese. She had grown up an activist fighting against Portuguese colonialism. She actually goes to school in Portugal, then comes back to Cape Verde and continues the struggle. Cape Verde gets independence in the 1970s, around the same time as Guinea-Bissau. And she is influenced by thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, who was another Cape Verdean revolutionary who fought in Guinea-Bissau, fought against the Portuguese. And once Cape Verde gets independence, she continues to struggle against domestic violence in Cape Verde, struggling for a number of women's rights issues. Well, she also gets involved in these the women's rights movement throughout the African continent, and she also becomes a commissioner on the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. She's one of the 11 commissioners that are responsible for upholding this charter and investigating human rights abuses, as well as promoting human rights throughout the continent. So, and she's the first woman commissioner. I forgot to mention that. You know, the African commission is set up, and for the first couple of years, it's all men. She's actually the first woman on the commission. So she writes this, and if you wouldn't mind sharing this, or she says this at the seminar that has been organized by a number of the women's rights organizations. She says, she starts her speech going through a history of African women's struggles. She talks about Queen Njenga from Central Africa, and she talks about the global feminist struggle. And then she gets on to talking about the charter and talks about what I mentioned before, that there's a lack of recognition of women's rights in the original charter. And she says, given this dual recognition of the absence of specific norms on the rights of African women in the African charter, and the need to include the fundamental right of men and women to work to equality, it may be appropriate to think about the development of a strictly African legal instrument within the framework of the African charter. In this instrument, it should systemize and crystallize a variety of principles and norms on the status of African women, or simply record the fundamental right to equality. Hence, the choice to create a specific instrument at the level of the African continent to achieve this common goal. In conclusion, I have the honor to propose that the legal instrument to which I have just referred may take the form of an additional protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights concerning the rights of the woman. She introduces this idea. She introduces this idea in 1995 with all these experts present. We're not going to amend the charter. We're going to add to it. We're going to create another document that's going to be in addition to the charter that's going to look at the specific rights of women. So a group was tasked with organizing this. A working commission. So of course Vera Duarte is on this. You had Julianne Odezelle Galinga from the Republic of Congo, and then you had Evie Odankwa, legal scholar from Ghana, who was also on the commission. And actually it was Dankwa that did the initial draft of this new protocol that's going to be on women's rights, taking in all the ideas from the experts that had met in Lomé, Togo, and Vera Duarte and others. So they looked at the situation, that everything that I just mentioned, what was going on economically, what was going on politically in 1995. And this year is important, 1995, because just a year earlier, one of the most tragic events happened in African history. That was the Rwandan genocide in 1994. That has its roots in colonization. We talked about that in previous classes. But that happened, and the effects of that on African women, on the women in Rwanda, are you should read about. I mean, we talk about rapes and killings, and you guys know that story of the Rwandan genocide. So all of that has happened the year before, and a number of other socio and economic problems that we mentioned as a result of neoliberalism. So they need to come up with a document, a draft that's going to address this rights, and they do. And I'll just move past this. This took a long time, from the call to draft this in 1995 to when this document actually becomes finalized and adopted, all the way in 2003. So from 1995, when Vera Duarte called for this to be created, to 2003, you have different experts, women's rights organizations, all getting together, drafting this document. And then the ultimate thing is states had to say that they were okay with it, because experts could come up with all types of legal ideas and what they want in it. But ultimately, though, it's the states, the governments that say, all right, we agree to this document. So it took a lot of negotiation, a lot of drafting, a lot of things were put in it, a lot of things were taken out. You had women like Yatende Tariba from the OAU's gender unit who participated, Berhani Waswork, who I talked about before, who brought in this idea that if we're going to write this document, we can not only address the typical human rights but ideas, but also the problems in traditional African culture that are affecting African women and children that need to be addressed. Then you had Faiza Muhammad from Equality Now that brought in more ideas. So this was a collaborative effort that lasted for 8 years, 1995 to 2003. And ultimately, in 2003, the final draft was adopted. And it became the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women in Africa. So in addition to restating many of the rights that were in the original charter, recognizing, when I say CP, I mean civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, they added new things, new ideas to what women's rights needed to be upheld, including the right to development. Women have the right to peace. That's not in a lot of documents, just that people inherently have the right to peace. The right to reproductive and sexual rights. Women have the right to say how many children they're going to have. Now that might seem like, well, that's common sense, but no, it wasn't. And that needed to be written down into law. That women could say, no, I control my own body. I'm going to have the right to have this is how many kids I want, and this is what it will be. I'm not going to be pressured by my husband or society or anything like that. So sexual and reproductive rights that weren't in the original charter. They had provisions that spoke exclusively to women in particular situations. The rights of widows, that wasn't mentioned in the charter. E.V.O. Donkwa made sure the male male legal expert that worked on this, the lone male legal expert that worked on this, and E.V.O. Donkwa has written a lot about widows' rights in Africa. Because in a lot of African societies, widows were treated really bad. Your husband died, his family could come and take all the property and leave a widow with nothing. And, you know, particularly if she couldn't remarry again, you're in a horrible situation. So he said, we need to protect the rights of widows. We need to protect against female genital mutilation. And here was one that really got a lot of debate. So, I studied the history of the drafting of this charter. And the final version says, monogamy is the ideal form of marriage, but the rights of women in polygamous marriages will be upheld. One of the original drafts said, we're going to eliminate polygamy in Africa altogether, meaning you can't have more than one wife. But other experts weighed in and said, nah, you can't do that because that's part of African culture. And there are women that are in polygamous marriages. So we need to make sure that their rights are upheld. If you're the second, third, fourth wife, you have rights as well, not just the first wife. So if we outlaw polygamy, where does it leave those women? So they came to this compromise in that they would say monogamy is the ultimate, the best form, but women in polygamous marriages will have their rights respected. So that was a key compromise. They protected the rights of elderly women and disabled women. The original charter didn't mention anything about disabled people, period. And now this charter is saying these people have particular rights that need to be upheld. You can't just have blanket statements about women. You need to make sure that you're really pinpointing elderly women. They have particular issues that need to be protected and fulfilled by the government. Women that are disabled, so on. Also added protections for women that were refugees, because there was time and time again in Africa, a refugee crisis, internally displaced people that are leaving areas of conflict. And the most vulnerable in a lot of those situations are women and children that are refugees. So the rights of women as refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, returnees, all of that was added because this is, again, an 8-year period between 1995 and 2003 that these drafters get to look at what's going on in Africa, where we're seeing the Darfur crisis happen. Between 1995 and 2003, we see a war in the Congo it's really Africa's world war, right? And it goes past 2003, actually. But in the 1990s, early 2000s, you have Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Congo, Zimbabwe, South Africa, all fighting this war in Eastern Congo, where millions of people are displaced, people die. Rwanda gets disproportionately rich as a result of that, but that's whole nother story. But all of this is going on. So the drafters are seeing this in real time. They're seeing how this is affecting women that have to move their entire families, that are in refugee camps, that are internally displaced. What are their rights? What about the right to return? So all of this is going on, and they recognized all this. And I'm bringing this up not to say that these treaties are being completely upheld by African governments. They're not. They're not even close. But the fact that they exist is a victory. It's a victory because this is legally binding cultural documents that say, as women living on the African continent, this is what you can expect from this is what you should expect from your governments. This is what we want the future of Africa to look like. So before this stuff was written down, you couldn't make a legal claim against these things in Africa. Now you can. Now that there's something for activists and individuals to look at to say, this is what African states agreed to in 2003, that they were going to protect these things. Now we have a measuring stick. We can look at Nigeria. We can look at Uganda. We can look at Egypt. We can look at Algeria. We can look at Mozambique, and we can say, are you upholding these things? And then organize and be active as a result of that. As I close up, while all this was going on, Africa is moving. Africa is moving in a different direction. The next president after Nelson Mandela was Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki becomes the president of South Africa, and he is one of the main articulators of this idea of African Renaissance. So we see all the things that happened in the 1990s and the 80s and 90s. And when he comes president, he says things like this. He says, as South Africans, we owe our emancipation from apartheid. So apartheid just ended 5 years before, in no small measure to the support and solidarity extended to us by all the peoples of Africa. In that sense, our victory over the system of white minority domination is an African victory. This, I believe, imposes an obligation on us to use this gift of freedom, which is itself an important contribution to African Renaissance, to advance the causes of peoples of our continent. So we're seeing, by the time we get to the late 1990s, new leaders emerge that are starting to think about the OAU. They're starting to think about this organization that all the African states belong to. And they're saying, what is the future of this organization? Because it met its goal. Remember when we talked about back in 1963, when Nkrumah and Haile Selassie and Sekou Touré and the other leaders got together to create the OAU. It was a compromise organization. It wasn't the United States of Africa that Nkrumah wanted. And it was the goal of the OAU became the total liberation of Africa. We have to end colonization of Africa. That's the goal. Well, by the 1990s, that goal was complete. When apartheid was over, that goal was done. What is the purpose of the OAU? So the leaders got together in Sirte, Libya in 1999 to discuss the future of the OAU. And the ideas of Nkrumah started to come back. They never really completely went away. But now you got leaders like Muammar Gaddafi. You got leaders like Wade from Senegal that are saying, you know, when we look back at what Nkrumah wrote in the 60s about Africa uniting and all the problems that could be avoided if Africa was unified, maybe we should start thinking about that as we go into the 21st century. And the leader of this idea was Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Gaddafi had taken over Libya in a military coup, in 1969. 1969, Libya was the poorest country in Africa. The poorest. All the measures, all the UN measures, Libya was the poorest country in Africa. Gaddafi takes over, uses Libya's oil wealth, takes over from a monarchy. So he takes over the military coup from a monarch that was supported by the West, King Idris, who's from Eastern Libya. That becomes important later on. He takes over from this monarch. He establishes what's called the Jamahiriya, or the state of the masses. And between 1969 and 2011, Libya goes from being the poorest country in Africa to one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, and more importantly, from the lowest human development index in Africa to the highest human development index in Africa, which means in terms of life expectancy, in terms of healthcare, education, standard of living, Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa. So it went from the lowest to the highest in almost 30 years under Gaddafi and his government. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, Gaddafi had set himself up as a defender of the rights of Palestinians. He had kind of really put himself in with the Arab world. But by the time we get to the 1990s, a lot of his Arab colleagues had turned their backs on him. Now, Gaddafi is not an Arab, despite what most people think. Even though he is a Muslim and he's from North Africa, Gaddafi is an Amazigh. Gaddafi is a Berber. They're people that are indigenous to North Africa, but they speak Arabic and, you know, that type of thing. So when the Arabs kind of turned their back on Gaddafi, Gaddafi started to look more toward the rest of the continent. And he starts changing his own ideology in the 1990s, and he starts reading more Nkrumah, and he comes to realize that, you know what, Nkrumah was right. if Africa wants to defeat dependency, if Africa wants to be a strong superpower, Africa needs to unite. So by the time we get to 1999, in this meeting in Sirte, Libya, Sirte is a town in Libya, it's actually Gaddafi's hometown. September 9th, 1999, he gives a speech to the other African leaders. And he started wearing things like this. I just love this shirt. Can you zoom in on this really quickly? Because if you look at what he's wearing, he has Lumumba on his shirt. He has Mandela on his shirt. He has Haile Selassie on his shirt. He has Julius Malema on his shirt. He has Nasser. He has Nkrumah on his shirt with these the African continent. I think that's Sekou Touré over there. So he starts dressing like this. He starts showing that he believes in Pan-Africanism. Thank you. And it's not just cosmetic. Let me get out of this one. Thank you for that. It's not just cosmetic. He starts just like Nkrumah used Ghana's resources for African unification. Gaddafi starts to use Libya's resources for African unity. And in this meeting, the heads of state of the African countries get together and they say, all right, we're going to do away with the OAU and we're going to form something new called the African Union. And let me get back on this. We're going to start the African Union. We're going to move from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. We're going to set up new structures like the Pan-African Parliament, where there's going to be 5 representatives from every African country. It's going to form this Pan-African Parliament, and 2 of them have to be women. We're going to, no longer is it going to be the case that African states can't interfere in each other's affairs. That was one of the key elements of the old OAU, that there's going to be no interference, that whatever goes on in Ghana, that happens in Ghana. Nigeria has nothing to say about it. Now they're saying, no, our conflicts are spilling over. So therefore, we need to have a united way to address conflicts that happen anywhere on the continent. So no more of that non-interference. It was going to be a stronger organization that was going to explicitly push for a more unified Africa. But just like in 1963, where you had some people that were for it, you had some people that were for it in 1999, people like Gaddafi and others, then you had a whole lot of countries that were against it. But they couldn't be as openly against it because it became an incredibly popular idea. Gaddafi was the new Nkrumah in terms of his ideas about African unity. Let me mention this and then I'll close. In Mbeke in 2004, he traveled to Haiti to celebrate Haiti's 200 years of freedom. And again, I just like to bring this together because we're looking at Africans from all over the world. This African Renaissance is today we're engaged in a historic struggle for the victory of the African Renaissance because we are inspired by, among others, the Haitian Revolution. We are engaged in struggle for the regeneration of all Africans in the Americas, the Caribbean, Africa, and everywhere, because we want to ensure that the struggle of our people here in Haiti, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, Europe, and Africa must never be in vain. So that was Thabo Mbeki, the president of South Africa, when he went to Haiti in 2004. Not long after this, that president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, is going to be kidnapped by the Americans and dropped off in the Central African Republic in essentially a military coup. But that's another discussion for another time. But Mbeki is talking about this African Renaissance. And he's one of the people that are kind of with Gaddafi on this idea of Africa uniting. So where we'll stop today is here. Because as we bring it up to the modern day, this becomes where the state of the African Renaissance is. In the early 2000s, it was on everybody's tongue. Everybody was talking about the African Renaissance, Africa uniting, Africa having one military, one economic system. The same ideas that Nkrumah was talking about 40 years earlier in 2003 when the African Union is established, or 2002 when the African Union is established. Those ideas are starting to become, looks like it's going to be a reality. But then things happen. So next week, we will talk about the past 20 years, between 2002 and 2022, and what is this current state of the African Renaissance in the African world, and the key role that people like Muammar Gaddafi played in that. So I'll stop now. I'll take some questions that we'll record, and then we'll turn off the recording. We got about 15 minutes for some Q&A, general announcements. Before, as Daniel, you look in the chat for me, and people, please raise your hand if you have questions. While I'm doing that, just want to remind everybody that Jaku Combat is having their Father's Day event next Saturday. Tickets are still available, but they're going fast. So if you're interested, go to the website, you can call Jaku Combat and reserve your tickets for that event. It's at the Bronson Center next Saturday evening. It's going to be food, it's going to be music. It's going to be a good time. So bring out your father figure, or anybody in your, that, you know, fits that role in your life, and we'll have a good time. Daniel, any questions in the chat? And if you're talking, I can't hear you. I don't know if he can hear me. Are there any hands up?
There's no questions in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Are there any hands? Anybody have any questions? I can't see the hands. Are there any announcements? Oh, Mr. Francis, go ahead. I can see one hand up.
Yes, was there any proof that Muammar Gaddafi had a hand in the bombing of Panama 103 flights? And was that used as a pretext to get us by the Americans?
That was in 1986. So there wasn't a lot of proof. So what happens is 1986, this plane is shot down. Gaddafi is blamed for it. There wasn't a lot of proof. And then the Americans attacked Libya in 1986 and bombed Libya under Reagan, and actually killed Gaddafi's adopted daughter in that bombing. But eventually, in the 1990s or late 90s, around the same period, Gaddafi decides that Libya never took responsibility per se. But it was like one of those out of court settlement type things. I think they paid some money to the survivors or something like that without taking responsibility. But the other thing that Gaddafi did that kind of might have spelled his doom, after 2003, after the U.S. invaded Iraq with the excuse that, you know, Saddam was making weapons of mass destruction, which still haven't been found, Gaddafi, not wanting that fate to happen to him, gave up Libya's nuclear program to the West. He said, look, we'll stop making nuclear weapons or trying to make nuclear weapons. And that was a mistake because that made Libya weak in some regards. And then a couple of years later, which we'll talk about next week, there's an invasion of Libya. But yeah, we'll get into that. But yeah, that was an interesting thing, 1986, that occurred. And that led to a whole lot of things. But all this is really the result of Gaddafi's policies in Africa. But at the time in the 80s, Gaddafi's policies in terms of supporting the Palestinians, that made him one of the big pariahs to Western interests.
Yes. Can you possibly explain why America would invade Libya and not Saudi Arabia, where there were 14 or 19 hijackers involved in the Twin Tower events in September?
Because it was never about justice for the folks from 9/11. Because you're right, it would be, and it's never about upholding human rights, which is another lie that's often told when the U.S. invades places, even including Libya. Because everybody knows what the Saudis do to critics of the regime, what Saudis do in terms of women's rights, and all those things. But because they're an ally of the United States in terms of oil and other things, and particularly the tacit support for Israel that the Saudi family displays, they'll never be invaded or anything like that. And then what happened with Iraq was something that went back to the early 90s. They always wanted to get out of Iraq. And same thing with Libya. But Libya, what we'll get into next week, is more about this idea. This is why Libya had to go, because of these ideas that Gaddafi was borrowing from Nkrumah, which made Nkrumah an enemy, which made Patrice Lumumba an enemy, which made Thomas Sankara an enemy. And then we see what happens with Gaddafi. And we'll talk about how we can avoid that in the years moving forward. Those are good questions. Anything else? Any other questions or discussion? So we'll turn off the recording for today and open it up to any general discussion, questions, or comments. We got about 5 minutes. Anything else folks want to bring up?
A quick question, Clyde.
Yeah.
So it's about the IMF and Jamaica and how they keep putting Jamaica into debt. What would be the implications for Jamaica if the country decided to just not pay it? Because I'm just thinking about like the U.S. being in debt and even the world being in debt, but it's not like anybody's trying to do anything about it. So Jamaica just said, forget that. So how would that benefit or hurt the country in the long run?
It's like just like personal credit too. Like you, if you default on your loans, it's harder to get more access to capital for other things. So you would need backup to do that. You would need some. So the U.S. can do that because the U.S. can back up either with aggression or with diplomacy, other types of things. But for Jamaica to default like that, it would be difficult to get the support needed to uphold the economy. Without that, you need tremendous support, and this is one of those reasons why Gaddafi, Nkrumah, others are saying we need bigger political units to absorb some of these things, so that countries like Jamaica don't have to go at it alone when they're up against, say, people like the IMF. That's the best thing I can answer to that I can give you right now. I wish we had an economist on it that could really give you a good answer on that, but that's what I could think right off the top. Yeah, you need a lot of support. And there's countries that, again, the movements are made to try to get countries out of these things. This movement in Africa, the African unification movement, around this same time in Latin America, you had the ALBA movement going on that was being led by Venezuela, the Bolivarian alternative movement, which was trying to do the same things in South America, to unite, have one currency, kind of move away from that IMF World Bank model. And that came under attack as well. So you got movements for that, and they will continue to happen because it's the right move to go. But we just got to support those and continue to talk about it. But yeah, that's a good question. All right. Yes.
Why did the U.S. get rid of Aristide in Haiti?
Say it again.
Why did the U.S. get rid of Aristide in Haiti?
Okay. A few reasons. One, not long after that speech not long after that celebration of the 200 years of independence, Aristide started to advocate for the French to pay reparations to Haiti, particularly for the indemnity that the French put on Haiti not long after independence. Basically said, you got to pay for the war, pay for your freedom, or we're going to reinvade the country. And it was, in today's money, billions of dollars that crippled Haiti's economy. So that was one thing that he did. The other thing, you have American business interests in Haiti. And what Aristide was proposing was an increase in the minimum wage. Because you got a lot of apparel companies in Haiti that make billions of dollars exploiting Haitian labor and a whole bunch of other things. And so you have a business elite in Haiti, as well as business interests from the U.S. that are operating in Haiti that said we can't have this guy as president anymore because he's going to cut into the profits. So we're going to get rid of him. Now, I'm not saying Aristide did everything perfect in Haiti, but he was democratically elected twice. And the U.S. got rid of him twice. The first time under Bush, the father, in the early 1990s, they sponsored the coup. And then in 2004, they essentially, and it was an attack. The Marines grabbed him and basically put him on a plane. They said, this is for your own safety. Took him on a plane all the way to Central African Republic and like dropped him off in Africa. It's the craziest story, but it's real. And a lot of this was negotiated, and the plans for this were made right here in Ottawa, because this was a collaboration between Canada, the U.S., and France, and some of the business elite in Haiti. So it's an interesting story. There's a video, a great documentary about it that I'll post on the website if you want to know more about that. But it's a very interesting story. And we look at what's going on in Haiti today. It's a direct result of these continued interventions. I think we might have talked about Haiti in one of the other classes, but I'll put the link to that up. Yes.
That would be great, thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, everybody. Next week is our last session for this course. And then we start the entire cycle over again in July, where we will go all the way back, because this is our last course for the year, or our year. And then we start the cycle over again. So we start back with ancient Africa all the way back. And we'll do that in July. So thank you all again for being with us. And I will see you next week. All right. I forgot to mention these books.